So I was really interested when I received this invitation from Charisse. Actually, I'm going to go back here. And also to have the opportunity to be present at the symposium because I'm in the very early research phases of an exhibition project that's interested in exploring the visual strategies that have been employed by artists and activists to engage with the issue of anti-Black violence. And this is in the context of the US starting in the 1890s and coming to the present. I was particularly interested in putting our contemporary conversations about representations of violence in a longer historical context. So thinking about how to put these current debates in this long historical context, and particularly the ethical concerns and political considerations around the depictions around the suffering Black body, and interested in exploring what kind of alternatives were out there and what kind of alternatives have artists and activists engaged in over the years. As a curator, I'm also equally interested in museums' methodological approaches and approaching presenting works of art that may be perceived as challenging because of their subject matter. So in that way, I'm interested in some of the same questions that the Blanton has grappled with in presenting Vincent Valdez's work. So mainly, how does an art museum create context for encountering challenging works and urgent ideas that considers the nuances of differing positions? And how can museums engage with a variety of audiences, constituencies, and staff in doing this work? Namely, how do you proceed with compassion for these various constituencies and the fact that viewing is not just a learning experience, an intellectual exercise, but it's also an emotional exercise, and not just for audiences of color, but for everyone who's going to encounter this work. So the seed of this project has been with me for many years, but I'm only just now having the opportunity to really focus on it primarily, and I'm at this stage in the research process where I'm absorbing information and trying to give shape to half-formed ideas and really have more questions and answers. And so I thought, by way of addressing the theme of today's panel, which is representing race in the history of art, I would focus on kind of two objects or items that are presently preoccupying my thoughts and around which certain ideas and questions are starting to take shape. And so I hope that this will help prompt some conversations for the panel. And the first is a work of art, and really thinking again about how issues of race inform the way in which we analyze artworks. And the second is really thinking about how issues of race and racism inform the spaces in which we practice art history. So think about the university and the museum as these kinds of sites. So on the screen, you see a reproduction of a 1934 illustration by the white American artist Reginald Marsh. A crowd of men and women are variably clad in work boots and overalls, dresses and high heels, and they're crammed together with their gazes mostly pointed to some action or spectacle that's located outside of the picture plane on the left, from which a light or some kind of warm glow seems to be emanating. A series of curved lines in the upper right background, which are a little hard to make out in this image, suggests that the crowd continues for quite some distance. In the foreground, there's a woman who's holding a young girl aloft so that she can get a better view. The young girl holds her chin with her hand and a finger over her mouth in a contemplative gesture. The facial expressions of many of those in the crowd are obscured, but the ones that are visible range from a look of shock to there's a sort of intense concentration, to a sheepish grin, to the woman who's holding the child seems somewhat jovial, or to this woman all the way on the far right who seems slightly worried. The location of the work is indeterminate. The ground suggests a combination of grass and dirt. There's developed trees in the distance, and there's a building that could be a house or a series of houses or other structures. But there's nothing in the image itself to indicate definitively the location of the gathering or the reason for the gathering. Now, the title of this work is "This is Her First Lynching." And so with this title, then we're kind of, it sort of firmly locates the action of the scene and the sort of reason for this gathering in a way that the image itself leaves highly ambiguous. This was a work that first appeared as a full-page illustration in The New Yorker in September of 1934, and in that same fall, Marsh donated the work to the NAACP's national office located in New York. At the opening of her recent book, The Urban Scene, Race, Reginald Marsh, and American Art, Carmenita Higginbotham notes that, in a thank you note to Marsh, Walter White, the NAACP's African-American executive secretary, expresses gratitude for this donation and states that, quote, "We are placing it in our office here as the nucleus of a collection of drawings dealing with lynching. Your drawing is, in my personal opinion, the most effective one I have ever seen. I have taken the liberty of recommending it to the Pulitzer Prize Committee. I do hope my admiration will be shared by members of the award committee," end quote. Higginbotham goes on to observe that by the earliest 20th century, the Black subject was visualized within the context of lynching, not only in the context of souvenir photography, which many of us may be familiar with, but also as political propaganda that used African American figures to sway the sympathies of white patrons toward the anti-lynching cause. And however, this is her first lynching is hardly an archetypal lynching scene, and that White's assessment of it as the, quote, most effective one he's ever seen is really about thinking about for whom the work was intended, who the audience was, which would primarily be white New Yorkers. Higginbotham goes on to state that it's an image about Black bodies in which the Black body is absent. But I would contend that it is equally an image about white bodies. And by removing the presence of the Black body that is ostensibly the target of the lynching, Marsh focuses on the crowd, and it draws our attention to the lynching spectacle as not only an act of Black victimization, but as an act of white socialization, and as a rite of passage, as suggested by the emphasis placed on the title on this young girl, that this is her first lynching. And so when we hear the title of this panel, Representing Race in the History of Art, I would imagine that there would still be a tendency to think that this would be focusing solely on representations of people of color in artworks or works by people of color. But the way of thinking about race as a category in art history has been contested for quite some time. One of these developments has been the development of the critical race art history, a term most commonly attributed to the art historians Kamau Holloway and Jacqueline Francis. That critical race art history builds upon critical race theory, a methodology pioneered by legal studies scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell, among others, that looks at race not just as a category of identification, but as a theoretical approach that uses race as a frame through which to engage, understand, and critique works of art. It also is an intersection of whiteness studies, which is a theoretical approach more broadly, but within the history of art, is about unmasking the ways in which whiteness is naturalized and made invisible in the visual sphere. And so my discussion of this work kind of lies at the intersection of these two approaches. So this work was embraced by Walter White as part of the visual arsenal used in the NAACP's anti-lynching campaign, particularly leading up to the vote to the Costigan-Wagner bill in 1935, which was the second anti-lynching legislation that was introduced. The work was reproduced in The Crisis, the NAACP's official engine, in January of 1935. And this was part of a larger strategy in the 1920s and 30s that the NAACP used in the pages of this magazine of reproducing sort of actual lynching photographs, but also artworks as part of their larger kind of anti-lynching strategy. So after its reproduction in The Crisis, it seems from correspondence that there were many requests made to use Marsh's image. One of those in particular was for this flyer, and pardon, this is like my note-taking photograph in the NAACP archives. Of this flyer that was created for anti-lynching mass meeting by the Philadelphia Committee on Race Relations of the Society of Friends. in his correspondence with the committee organizer, it's noted that they were expecting a multiracial, though predominantly white group for the meeting, and that the use of this kind of caption, are you against lynching? In this, then the applied you would be the predominantly white potential attendees who may see themselves in the ordinaries of the crowd, and that they're kind of playing on using this tactic of not there being a repulsion at the sight of the black victim, but rather a questioning of whites' moral complicity in lynching. So essentially, you're functioning as a spectator if you're not actively working to combat it. Mm-hmm. So this work was also included in an exhibition that White organized in 1935 in New York entitled An Art Commentary on Lynching. This was also an exhibition that featured a multiracial group of artists, so including Marsh, but Philip Guston, Hale Woodruff, but also Osama Noguchi, Jose Clemente Orozco. But you can also see in here that, again, Marsh's image is atypical of the works that were, these are just sort of a sample from the catalog, where the focus really is on thinking about this active lynching and the focus on the black body. So this focus on the crowd reminded me of the strategy that is employed by a contemporary artist, Ken Gonzalez-Day, with his series, Erased Lynching series, one of which we see here on the right, which is currently on view in Day's two-person exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I think Gonzalez-Day, like Vincent Valdez, has explored the history of lynching in the West and the sort of understanding that while nationally African Americans were the kind of primary target of this type of violence, that it was also directed toward Mexican Americans, toward Chinese immigrants, and toward other groups. And in this series, Day takes the gesture of looking at these historic photographs that are of lynching scenes and erasing the bodies from view. So again, that we're focusing on this crowd. So what this work and constellation with Marsh, the kind of question that it brings up for me as a strategy of, how does our understanding shift when we focus, our focus moves from the black body to the white crowd. And then in the couple minutes that I have left, I wanted to focus on another item that's sort of a preoccupation of mine, which is anti-racist activist Robin DiAngelo's current best-selling book, White Fragility: Why Is It So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism? And I think this touches on issues sort of raised by Marsh's work, but also the context in which we're engaging with these issues, again, in the space of universities and in museums that are still both predominantly white in terms of staff and audience. And I know that white fragility as a catch-all phrase to point to a constellation of behaviors is a highly contested term, and we can maybe talk about that or not. But I think there's some usefulness in it. DiAngelo's argument is multi-layered and multi-pronged, but I just wanted to kind of point to 2 or 3 points I think that relate to this discussion. One of her points about this idea of why it's so difficult to talk about racism in a constructive way is that many whites, and she's speaking as a white person, as is to say, have a simplistic definition of racism and a simplistic definition of what a racist is. That in this post-civil rights era, that they've been taught to see racists as, quote, mean people who intentionally dislike others because of their race, and that racists are immoral, and that acts of racism are intentional acts of racial discrimination committed by amoral individuals. And so that this kind of categorization of what race and racism is then allows for that to be only assigned to kind of extreme cases, and that there's this disidentification process that can take place. And this then leads to a kind of second point which she makes, which is that they don't understand how socialization works. And I think this speaks to the Marsh image very particularly, and sort of think about racism as, again, as incidental and not structural and systemic, and so that an understanding that if you are socialized and brought up in a racist society, that's going to affect both how you see yourself and others, whether you bring that into conscious awareness or not. And so that the work then is lifelong work, she says, to disrupt the forces of racism, and that in order to, quote, interrupt white fragility, we need to build our capacity to sustain the discomfort of not knowing, the discomfort of being racially unmoored, and the discomfort of racial humility. And so my kind of question that's revolves around this, so how do institutions build the capacity to withstand discomfort as we continue to work through issues raised by challenging artwork? And so I hope that our collective efforts today will be one point in this capacity building. Thank you.